Ukraine has been offered a peace. If Ukraine accepts, then it will hand Russia the victory that it sacrificed everything to try and prevent. Last week, Ukrainian authorities were presented with a 28-point peace proposal co-authored by envoys from Russia and the United States, with Ukraine and its European allies completely excluded from the discussion. The plan, quite frankly, is impossible for Ukraine to accept. It is a near-carbon copy of the diplomatic wish list that Russia has been clinging to since the war's opening hours, and it would practically guarantee that Russia could invade Ukraine again in the very near future. But Washington has made it abundantly clear. Ukraine is expected to accept the deal. It must accept the deal unchanged, or Washington's going to leave it behind. It's an impossible situation for Kyiv, and one that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky laid out in stark terms. Quote, "Now Ukraine may find itself facing a very difficult choice, either loss of dignity or the risk of losing a key partner." Zelensky faces an existential choice at a moment of clear weakness on the home front: reject the deal and get ready to pay for Ukraine's survival with even more lives than before, or accept it and lay the foundation for Ukraine to be swallowed completely by Russia in the coming years. Right now, everything matters. The precise terms of the proposal, the situation inside Ukraine and on the battlefield, the circumstances behind the proposal's very creation, and the all-out effort from Ukraine and its remaining allies to find some other way forward. After nearly 4 years of continuous all-out war, this is Ukraine's moment of truth, and the chances of any real victory are vanishingly small. Just before we continue with the video today, here's something weird. I've started to use headphones that don't actually go in my ears, and it turns out it's pretty cool. This video is sponsored by Raycon and their new bone conduction headphones. They let you hear music, podcasts, calls, whatever, through vibrations in your bones, not in your ears, which means, if you're out and about, your ears are open to the world, you can hear what's going on around you. There's nothing blocking it. They're fantastic. I live in a city. It's pretty useful being able to hear what's going on around you in the city. You can get your music going, you can hear everything, but you can still hear if there's a car going to come past that's going to run you over, which is brilliant. They're IP68 waterproof and tow rain, sweat, beach runs, no problemo. 13 hours of battery life, and they don't move or fall off there. Nothing. They're comfortable, they stay put, they don't seal you off from reality. So, Black Friday is coming fast, and Raycon's going big, up to 30% off anything site-wide. Just click the link in the description or head to buyraycon.com/warfrontsbc to check it out. Again, that's buyraycon.com/warfrontsbc. And now back to today's video. The peace plan. Now, before we get into the specifics of the peace plan that was presented to Ukraine last week, we've got to take a moment and explain one critical piece of context, something that we'd strongly encourage you to keep in mind for the duration of today's episode. Everything we discussed today, every point within this peace plan, and every bit of negotiation that comes afterward needs to be interpreted in context of the threat of a second Russian invasion. That's the dark but distinct possibility that Russia intends to set overwhelmingly favorable terms for peace, force Ukraine to agree, and then, once Ukraine has downsized its military, neutered its defense capabilities, and sworn off any protection from the US or Europe, Russia will reinvade and take Ukraine over for good. That's a possibility that Ukrainian and European leaders and an abundance of international conflict experts have been warning about for years, and we don't want to give too big of a spoiler, but suffice it to say that this most recent proposal has validated those fears instead of calming them. Remember, Russia has been very clear since the start of this conflict. It wants to destroy Ukraine's sovereign government, destroy the very idea of Ukraine, and either annex it outright or create a Russian-backed puppet state in its place. Russia has the capabilities. Think back to the early days of the Ukraine invasion, and Russia was stonewalled because of easily avoidable, frankly idiotic logistical failures, not because it lacked the strength to conquer Ukraine if it had fought competently. By establishing a favorable peace deal, while placing a set of sweeping limitations on Ukraine's ability to arm or defend itself in the future, conflict observers fear that Russia could spend a couple of easy years resting and training its soldiers, rebuilding its troop columns, and establishing a better invasion plan before crashing into Kyiv like it had planned to do in 2022. With everything that we're going to discuss today, bear in mind that that is the worst-case scenario and the one that Ukraine desperately needs to avoid. Now, the draft peace proposal that the United States presented to Ukraine last week was the product of a series of secretive closed-door meetings between American presidential envoy Steve Witkoff and his counterpart from the Russian Kremlin. Ukraine and its European allies were excluded from the drafting process, and at least publicly, they were not alerted that the process was even taking place. The peace proposal consists of a total of 28 individual points, and while the proposal hasn't been formally published, as of the time of writing, copies of the plan have been circulated to the global press, allowing us to report on their contents. And if you'd like something else to bear in mind as we discuss the plan, we'd also be remiss not to mention that at least initially this proposal was not presented to Ukraine or the public as the sort of thing that was open to further negotiations. Quoting Donald Trump last Friday, he's going to have to approve it. He, meaning Zelensky. So, we're going to go through those 28 points and get a closer look at just how troubling, from Ukraine's perspective, this plan really is. Just a note, by the way, instead of reading through the proposal's individual items in sequence, we're going to be putting the 28 points into groups based on the issues that they're each intended to address so that we can fill the gaps and give important context just a bit more easily. And we'll start with the basics, the points of the plan that essentially say, this is a peace plan and anyone who signs it has agreed to a peace. According to the terms of the proposal, once its terms are agreed, Russia and Ukraine agree to the implementation of an immediate ceasefire, with both sides withdrawing to predetermined positions that we'll discuss in just a moment. That agreement will be legally binding, presumably under the terms of international law, and the implementation of the deal will be overseen by a so-called Board of Peace, similar to the structure that the US has applied to the war in Gaza. US President Donald Trump will serve as head of that Board of Peace. Once the deal is signed, the United States will moderate a dialogue between Russia and the NATO alliance, an interesting choice considering that the United States is, at least on paper, part of the NATO alliance instead of an independent arbiter, and during that dialogue, all sides will supposedly work toward de-escalation and address outstanding security concerns. The deal will take final shape by way of a, quote, total and complete comprehensive non-aggression agreement between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. The deal also includes a stipulation on that point that brings the sorts of implications that could fill an entire separate episode, quoting, all ambiguities of the last 30 years will be considered resolved. The proposal doesn't actually name what those ambiguities are. Then there are the stipulations about the region's future, specifically the way that Ukraine's territory is to be carved up. The Donbass regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, including areas that Russia has not yet conquered, are to be recognized as de facto Russian territory, along with the Isthmus of Crimea that Russia annexed back in 2014. That means that Ukraine would cede critical defensive points, like the land that used to be the city of Pokrovsk, as well as the large cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, without a fight. The United States would recognize Russia's claims to the territory, although the territory would, in practice, be, and we'll quote again here, considered a neutral demilitarized buffer zone. Russian forces will not enter this demilitarized zone. In the regions of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, territorial control will be frozen at the line of conflict between Russia and Ukraine, meaning that Russia would, by default, gain recognition and control of the territory that it currently controls. Outside of those 4 eastern oblasts and Crimea, Russia would give up the little pockets of territory it currently occupies, mostly in scattered areas across the Ukrainian border. The deal includes, quote, the expectation that Russia will not invade its neighbors, although for reasons we'll address in subsequent points of the deal, that expectation lacks any real teeth. From there, we can discuss the restrictions that the proposal, as initially revealed, would place upon Ukraine, in addition to the loss of about a fifth of its territory, including lands that Russia has never actually managed to conquer. Under this proposal, Ukraine would be expected to cap the size of its armed forces at 600,000 troops, a massive reduction from the 900,000 active duty personnel, 1.2 million reservists, and 100,000 paramilitaries that the country currently relies upon. Russia, with an even larger military that Putin ordered in 2024 to increase to nearly 2.4 million troops, including 1.5 million on active duty at any given time, would not restrict the size of its military in any way. Ukraine would be compelled to enshrine, as an amendment to its constitution, that it will not join the NATO alliance at any time while NATO agrees to pass new bylaws that state that it will not accept Ukraine into the bloc at any future point. It will have to give up the possibility that NATO troops could deploy into Ukraine either formally through the alliance or as a coalition of the willing through a stipulation that insists that NATO must agree not to station any troops in Ukraine. That's a choice of words that Russia could very easily generalize to claim that a coalition of the willing violates the ceasefire, invalidates the entire proposal, and allows Russia to return to war at its leisure. Ukraine would be compelled to hold a set of nationwide elections within 100 days of the deal being signed, ensuring both that Volodymyr Zelensky's term as leader would end and that a vote would take place on a rushed timeline during the chaos of an immediate ceasefire. That, of course, would provide Russia with very fertile ground to put its well-known tools of election interference and manipulation to work inside Kyiv. Finally, Ukraine agrees to be a non-nuclear armed state under the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, although we really should note here Ukraine is already a party to the NPT, and despite some chatter in the analysis world that we'd best describe it as geopolitical fan fiction, it's highly unlikely that Ukraine would ever even attempt the development of nuclear weapons while Vladimir Putin and his regime still live. Through the proposal, Russia would be expected to accept a couple of restrictions of its own, although they're far from the sort of thing that Ukraine would have to abide. Russia would re-engage with the US on nuclear non-proliferation, continuing efforts that are already underway to keep nuclear proliferation in check after the suspension of the New START Treaty in 2023. Russia would also have to pass laws that would, quote, legislatively enshrine a non-aggression policy towards Europe and Ukraine. Unlike Ukraine, this wouldn't have to be a constitutional amendment, and quite frankly, asking for a new commitment via the passage of a new law either misunderstands the way that Russia works, in a practical sense, or is intended to grant Moscow basically infinite leeway. Laws that are passed with Putin's support one day in Russia could be rescinded with his support on the next day. But even more important, those laws only constrain Russia's behavior to the extent that Russia voluntarily constrains itself. Practically speaking, Putin and his allies could form massive troop columns on the new redrawn Ukrainian border and repeal any such law only at the moment of invasion, if, that is, they bothered to repeal it at all. The NATO alliance would also have to accept restrictions, as hand in hand with the point that Russia won't invade its neighbors, NATO is barred from future expansion. That line of the proposal isn't just written to exclude Ukraine, it would bar any and all additions to NATO indefinitely. Europe would also commit to stationing its fighter jets in the nation of Poland as a security guarantee to Ukraine, a point that's important for several reasons at once. For one thing, it adds more limitations to Europe's ability to build a coalition of the willing to defend Ukraine from future attacks. For another, it places advanced air power at Ukraine's far edge, meaning that the parts of Ukraine that would be a front line in a future Russia reinvasion would be at the near edges of their range without aerial refueling, and targets deep in Russian territory would be inaccessible. And finally, as some analysts have noted, it implies that any aircraft positioned to defend Ukraine will be European ones, not American, which is going to be important when we discuss US security guarantees momentarily. From this deal, Russia would enjoy a few added perks and benefits. It would be reintegrated into the global economy and invited back to the G8 forum, today referred to as the G7, with Russia's absence. It would be granted phase-by-phase sanctions relief, and it would enter into multiple new partnerships with the United States. That would include a security task force where Russia and America would work together to, quote, promote and enforce compliance, with the deal with Ukraine, of course, not invited, while the two nations would also engage in a long-term economic agreement on items including energy, resource extraction, data centers, rare earth harvesting, AI, and more. Russia will gain a 50-50 share of all power generated at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant under Russian control since 2022. All parties in the war would receive, quote, full amnesty for wartime actions during the war and agree not to pursue claims or further settle grievances, meaning that Russian atrocities in places like Bucha, its notorious family separation and child re-education programs, its torture and abuse of POWs, and other wartime acts would essentially be excused. Technically, both sides would be subject to a number of tolerance-based items, promoting mutual understanding and eliminating racism and bias, guaranteeing the rights of Ukrainians and Russian media and education, renouncing and forbidding Nazi ideology, and more. But in practice, those are simple extensions of Russia's completely unfounded claims about denazification, genocide against Russian speakers, and other items that supposedly justified Moscow's invasion. And in practice, Russia's extensive controls over its media, education, internal investigative ability, and other elements of civil society would mean that Russia is at liberty to give token compliance or not comply at all as it sees fit, whereas Ukraine would be under far greater scrutiny. Ukraine would commit to, quote, EU rules of religious tolerance and the protection of linguistic minorities, which Russia essentially sees as a way to legitimize its claims of Ukrainian discrimination. And in one last benefit for Russia, the document calls for both sides to avoid changing the peace deal's territorial agreements by force in the future. While that would in practice constrain both sides, there's a bit more to it. Not only would that prohibit Ukraine from trying to regain territory that Russia ripped away from it by force, but the penalty for trying to take back territory is that external security guarantees will be voided. It's Ukraine that needs those security guarantees, not Russia, meaning that the deal lacks any teeth to stop Russia from starting a re-invasion if it chooses. In exchange, Ukraine does enjoy some benefits, although they're far less extensive than what Russia receives. The first point on the deal is that, quote, Ukraine's sovereignty is to be reconfirmed, but naturally, it's not clear who is supposed to do the reconfirming, or that Russia would ever have to acknowledge the idea, even just through its rhetoric. Ukraine then receives security guarantees from the United States, bearing in mind again that those guarantees will be used as leverage to prevent Ukraine from pursuing the recapture of its old territory, with Russia not subjected to anything comparable. Instead, the US commits to a, quote, robust coordinated military response if Ukraine is invaded again, plus the restoration of all global sanctions and the withdrawal of recognition over Russia's new territory. That all sounds very good, of course, until we remember that there are numerous conditions under which those guarantees could be voided, meaning that there are all sorts of ways that the US could justify not actually acting on those guarantees when the moment arrives. Also, Ukraine can't invade Russia or fire missiles at Moscow or St. Petersburg. That part seems fair enough, really. The United States will be compensated for the security guarantee that it provides, although the means of compensation are not yet established. In fairness, there are a small handful of wins for Ukraine peppered into the agreements, although they're relatively minor and wouldn't require any real compromise from Russia. Elsewhere in the deal, Russia commits to not obstruct Ukraine's use of the critical Dnieper River and calls for agreements to manage the free movement of grain shipments throughout the Black Sea. Under the deal, while Ukraine cannot join NATO, it remains eligible for European Union membership and will receive, quote, short-term preferred market access to the European market. This will happen while the details are being hammered out. Ukraine will also be the beneficiary of a, quote, robust global redevelopment package, including investment into high-growth industries like AI and data centers, US partnership in an overhaul of Ukraine's gas infrastructure, redevelopment and modernization in cities devastated during the war, infrastructure development, and mining and extraction of natural resources. The deal lays out the fate of frozen Russian funds, $100 billion of which will be invested into Ukraine's reconstruction, with the US enjoying a 50% share of all profits. Europe will be expected to match that contribution, while all remaining Russian funds will flow into a US-Russian set of joint initiatives to, quote, build a strong motivation not to return to conflict. Finally, the deal lays out a handful of broadly defined reconciliation measures. All prisoners and bodies held by each side will be exchanged, and, quote, all civilian detainees and hostages will be returned, including children. The proposal pledges a family reunification program and that, quote, provisions will be made to address the suffering of victims from the conflict, end quote. All in all, though, we do want to emphasize that there are some items in this peace deal that would address important Ukrainian concerns, like the return of prisoners of war and abducted children, the overwhelming balance of the proposal, as written, favors Russian interests. The deal would seriously constrain Ukraine's ability to defend itself, and it essentially prohibits Europe or the broader NATO alliance from providing the sorts of security guarantees that most European leaders would want. Instead, it forces Ukraine to rely on vague, easily nullified security guarantees from the United States at a time when even America's own NATO allies have real doubts about Washington's willingness to honor security commitments that are far stronger than what Ukraine's been offered. It agrees to a range of terms that Ukraine has categorically refused in every past attempt of negotiations, and it explicitly validates the claim and rhetoric that Russia's used for years to justify its invasion. In essence, it's the kind of deal that Ukraine would be expected to reject immediately, except that right now, it's not clear that Ukraine has a choice. Take it or leave it. As soon as the early rumors about Washington's peace terms started to circulate among the international press, it became clear that the deal was not expected to favor Ukrainian interests. Even before the draft of the deal was leaked, experts and policymakers pointed out that any proposal written in conversation between an American and a Russian envoy with no Ukrainian or European involvement at all probably wasn't going to be the sort of proposal that Ukraine could immediately accept. But before the full extent of the deal was shared with the press, the United States was already making it clear to Kyiv that, like it or not, Ukraine was expected to accept the deal unconditionally. According to sources speaking to Reuters, the United States threatened a complete cutoff of weapons shipments and intelligence sharing unless Ukraine signed the deal within the week. Per those same sources, quoting Reuters here, Kyiv was under greater pressure from Washington than during any previous peace discussions. The United States dispatched military delegation to Kyiv, where the US ambassador to Ukraine confirmed that the US was pursuing a, quote, aggressive timeline to get the deal done. According to US sources, Ukraine attempted to reframe the deal during those meetings as a starting point for future negotiations, but it's not clear that their efforts made much of an impact. We shared this particular Trump quote already, but it's worth stating again. He's going to have to approve it. Speaking on Friday to Fox News, Trump offered, quote, "They will lose in a short period of time. You know so. They're losing land. They're losing land." At one point on Saturday, Trump was asked what would happen if Ukraine and Zelensky ultimately rejected the proposal. Quoting him again, "Then he can continue to fight his little heart out." But Trump and his administration's initial force in pushing for the deal appeared to waver under intense domestic and international pressure. The announcements and the leaked draft of the deal were met with fierce opposition from European leaders, as well as bipartisan pushback from high-ranking legislators in Washington. Even within his own party, some leaders lambasted the draft proposal, with Republican Senator Tom Tillis stating, quote, "If administration officials are more concerned with appeasing Putin than securing real peace, then the president ought to find new advisors." Or here's former Senate leader Mitch McConnell. "Putin has spent the entire year trying to play President Trump for a fool." Late on Saturday, Trump attempted to walk back from the perceptions that this was an immediate make-or-break moment for Ukraine and that Ukraine had been pressured to accept the deal as is. In his Saturday statement to US reporters, Trump claimed that the deal was, quote, "not my final offer." But make no mistake that stance is a walkback by the Trump administration. When the White House first presented the deal, it made clear that Ukraine had until the end of this coming Thursday, Thanksgiving Day in the United States, and a neat little deadline for Trump to bring home a rhetorical win for his domestic supporters. Hopefully, it'll go without saying that for Ukraine and for Kiev's soldiers on the front lines, especially, improving the quality of Donald Trump's Thanksgiving is utterly irrelevant. Despite changing his tune on the Thanksgiving deadline, Trump doubled down on America's justification for pushing toward an end to the war as soon as possible, not just for geopolitical reasons, but for seemingly personal ones. Writing on his social media site on Sunday, in the all-caps blast that we've come to expect, "Ukraine leadership has expressed zero gratitude for our efforts," end quote. In the same statement, Trump blasted European nations for continuing to purchase Russian oil, although only Hungary and Slovakia, nations with relatively Trump-friendly leaders, continue to receive imported gas at this time. Trump criticized his predecessor, Joe Biden, for sending Ukraine weapons and money free of charge, and reiterated his long-held claim that Russia would not have invaded Ukraine at all if it'd been in charge of the United States at the time the war broke out. In essence, it was a return to the positions that Trump had consistently held on the campaign trail and has gone back to from time to time when the Ukraine conflict proves especially frustrating to deal with. Ukrainian leaders have suggested that perhaps Trump's plan may include a bit of wiggle room and that his initial hard stance might be a negotiating posture rather than an inviolable position on the deal. High-ranking Ukrainian parliamentarian Alexander Mezhko described the proposal as, quote, "definitely a non-starter, but I don't rule out that it might be part of Trump's game. He starts with something absolutely absurd and ludicrous which causes shock, and then he becomes more reasonable," end quote. But although Trump is known on the international stage for his preference to take very strong initial stances that can then be negotiated down, it's too early for Ukraine to be confident that that's what's happening here. That's because according to some outside experts, and especially those with a background in the Russian language, it's not clear that the United States even co-wrote the deal at all. Certain phrases in the deal are notable Russianisms, either phrases that don't sound very natural and aren't part of diplomatic language in English, but sound perfectly normal in Russian, or words and phrases that the US hasn't used to refer to the issues behind the Ukraine war, but Russia consistently has. US senators, including Republicans from Trump's own party, told the American press on Saturday that Marco Rubio himself had confirmed that the plan was not authored by the United States and was instead basically Russia's set of terms that the US had received from an intermediary. Rubio himself later insisted that the US did author the proposal using input from both Russia and Ukraine, which was notably excluded from the drafting process, and Rubio's State Department has tried to reinforce that claim. But even still, that position is rather dubious, given that the US senators who collectively stated otherwise cited Rubio himself as their source. As if pressure from Washington weren't enough already, we've also got to emphasize that this proposal comes at a moment of clear weakness for Kyiv. On the front lines, Ukraine is under immense pressure as it tries to maintain a foothold in the city of Pokrovsk and battles pressure across other sections of the Donbass on no man's land. The nation is in the midst of a desertion crisis, with some 40,000 people estimated to be leaving the military each month, most of them as they flee from training. Ukraine is about to roll into another harsh winter as it deals with relentless Russian attacks targeting its energy structure, clearly intended to place Ukraine's civilian population at risk of freezing to death during the coldest months of the year. And worst of all, by many miles, Kyiv is embroiled in a major corruption scandal, a scandal so major that it could justify both the Ukrainian public and Ukraine's allies in Europe losing their faith in Zelensky and his administration's ability to fight. And if you're interested in that, we published a separate episode on Ukraine's corruption crisis a few days ago. You can check it out if you want to. All told, Ukraine was already in its weakest position in years before this peace proposal even started circulating, and Washington and Moscow both know it. According to early polling, the Ukrainian public despises the peace proposal, with 75% strongly in opposition and 70% believing that Russia would attack again if the deal was signed, per the early numbers. But the larger issue remains. If Ukraine could ever be forced to capitulate on the threat that it could simply be abandoned and allowed to collapse, then this would be the time for outside powers to make that threat. The counteroffer. Despite the international pressure facing Ukraine, and despite the difficulty of its battlefield position, this story isn't over, at least not yet. Ukraine does retain the ability to vouch for its own interests, and although it can't force the United States to completely change its approach, it can at least draw a line in the sand and refuse to hand Russia the keys to a future reinvasion. And if Ukraine really plays its cards right, it may be able to bring the US back on side, returning Washington to the state of exasperation with Moscow that Trump was expressing hardly a month ago. If Ukraine is going to be successful in that effort, then it's going to need help from the EU. And right now, it appears that help is on the way. European leaders were stunned by Washington's initial proposal, mostly staying off the record in public, but letting the Trump administration have it in private. Speaking to Politico.eu, one senior European Union politician offered, Witkoff needs to see a psychiatrist, while a former French official offered as analysis, this proposal is likely to be rejected by everyone. According to the same article, when another European Union official was asked anonymously about the proposal, that person just started swearing for a while. Publicly, though, world leaders worked to engage the Trump administration as quickly as possible in order to pull Washington back from the brink. During the G20 in Johannesburg, NATO leaders Emmanuel Macron from France, Keir Starmer from Britain, Friedrich Merz from Germany, Mark Carney from Canada, and Alexander Stubb from Finland met with EU head Ursula von der Leyen and threw together the early foundations for a set of talks over the weekend. Those talks took place in Geneva on Saturday, bringing together senior officials from Ukraine and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. During the conference, EU leaders reiterated the positions they'd taken in the immediate aftermath of the deal's announcement, that Ukraine's borders cannot be changed by force, that its military strength cannot be diluted to the point that Ukraine would be vulnerable to a second attack, and that between Europe's substantial contributions to Ukraine and the clear strategic relevance of a ceasefire, Europe must consent to any peace deal by the time that it's agreed. For whatever it may be worth, Europe has recognized that this is a make-or-break moment for Kyiv, and that a failure to hold the line here, at all costs, will reset the balance of power on the European continent for the first time since the Cold War. At the same time, however, European officials and independent analysts have had to consider an uncomfortable possibility that even if this deal isn't intended to be a accord that Ukraine can't refuse, it might be intended to help the US disengage from the Ukraine war for good. Washington has issued Ukraine a proposal that, rightly or wrongly, it claims is the very best that it can offer and that it officially regards as the best chance to end the war. Russia has, by all outward indicators, agreed to the deal in principle as long as it doesn't change. So it's Ukraine left with the burden of refusal, and that makes it far easier for Washington to shrug its shoulders and say, we tried. Washington pulls up stakes, Europe responds with the strongest condemnations it can muster, and Washington offers something along the lines of, we've been telling you to increase your defense spending, so if you think Ukraine is so important for your continental defense, then, well, you go and pay for its war. Now, unfortunately, there's a big problem with that. Europe, in its current form, is not ready to support Ukraine without the United States unless Ukraine's defense of its homeland were to change dramatically. For Ukraine to continue fighting its current fight, Europe isn't enough, and Washington knows it. As of the time of writing, at the end of the day, local time on Sunday the 23rd in Kyiv, there's been some progress toward a better deal by way of those talks in Geneva. Speaking to the global press, Ukraine's lead negotiator, Rustem Umerov, expressed that there had been several rounds of group discussions over the deal between his delegation, the Americans, and the rest of Europe. Quoting Umerov here, "The current version of the document, although still in the final stages of approval, already reflects most of Ukraine's key priorities." Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky spoke online about the talks, pointing out that, quote, "We all need a positive outcome," and that, quoting again, "the bloodshed must be stopped, and we must ensure that the war is never reignited." Speaking from the G20 summit in South Africa, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, a key leader in NATO and the European Union, expressed that it's highly unlikely that an agreement will be set in stone by Thursday, considering the differences between the two sides. Quoting Merz here, "Wars cannot be ended by major powers over the heads of the countries affected." But even if it may not play well in the US media, a slower and more comprehensive negotiating process does tend to produce better outcomes, regardless of the nations or the conflict in question. Hammering out a 28-point peace plan in just a few days' time would be a difficult process, even if Russia and Ukraine's positions were far better aligned than they already are. If a fair, mutually acceptable peace deal is going to come out of this round of negotiations, then time and thoroughness are assets, not liabilities. The Geneva talks led to the release of a counterproposal to the joint American and Russian plan written by Europe's E3, Britain, France, and Germany. In essence, it takes the initial 28 points of the deal and modifies them substantially. Things like non-aggression pact between Russia, Ukraine, and NATO, plus the resolution of all prior ambiguities remain, while the new proposal dispenses with both the clause that NATO won't expand further and the rather meaningless expectation that Russia won't invade its neighbors. That is, of course, the thing that everybody's expected of Russia since before 2014, but the weight of international expectation hasn't been particularly useful. The Europe-endorsed deal raises the cap for the Ukrainian military to 800,000 troops in peacetime, implying the potential to expand it in wartime. It replaces most items where the US fills a certain function with the understanding that NATO will fill those functions collectively, and it reiterates that Ukrainian membership in NATO is dependent on a NATO consensus that doesn't currently exist. It stipulates that NATO will not permanently station troops in Ukraine during peacetime under its own command, thus leaving the door open for a coalition of the willing, and it demands US security guarantees for Ukraine that mirror NATO's Article 5, which Ukraine would still forfeit by invading Russia. The new draft calls for Ukraine to be, quote, "fully reconstructed and compensated financially, including through Russian sovereign assets that will remain frozen until Russia compensates damage to Ukraine," while the Joint Security Task Force that monitors this ceasefire deal will now include Europeans and Ukrainians. Ukraine still agrees to be a non-nuclear power and respect EU laws on religious and linguistic protections, but all territorial negotiations now start at the current line of contact, and Ukraine maintains its commitment to not try and take any territory back by force. There's no immunity for wartime acts, and while Ukraine still has to hold elections as soon as possible, there's no hard deadline for Kyiv to make that happen. All in all, it's a vastly better deal from Ukraine's perspective, with just one key challenge. Just as the constraints and stipulations of the initial deal were unacceptable to Ukraine, the constraints and stipulations of this deal are sure to be unacceptable to Russia. After the Geneva meeting, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio praised the, quote, progress made through negotiations, which he described as the, quoting again, best so far in this entire process, going back to when we first came to office in January. Those sentiments echoed Ukrainian head negotiator Andriy Yermak, who hailed, quote, very good progress in, quote, moving forward to the just and lasting peace Ukrainian people deserve. But those are still the statements by negotiators tasked with sitting in the room and hammering out a proposal that can be shown to Washington and Moscow. All that progress and all that optimism can go away if Trump, Putin, or both decide to simply reject this new proposal out of hand. Remember, this is far from the first attempt to reach a diplomatic settlement in Ukraine, and the most important parts of Russia and Ukraine's positions are fundamentally unchanged compared to where they've been in prior rounds of negotiation. Granted, it's not impossible that this could all turn out okay for Ukraine in the end, but there are a lot of ways for this process to go wrong, and a relatively low likelihood that Ukraine and Europe will stick the landing. As for what could go wrong, Unfortunately, it is quite the list. Ukraine, the US, and Europe could simply fail to come to terms around this current deal, with the US then taking its opportunity to disengage from Ukraine completely or dramatically reduce its involvement in the conflict. The US could be convinced to bring Ukraine's modified peace terms to Russia, only for Russia to react with fury and use the rejection of their ideal agreement to justify doubling down on their war effort, especially their attacks against energy infrastructure. Or, by trying to get the US to bring a better proposal to Russia, Moscow could gain a chance to manipulate the situation and Trump's enduring fondness for Vladimir Putin in order to get the US to disengage from Ukraine even more forcefully than it otherwise would have. After these talks, Ukraine and Europe have worked with Rubio's delegation to create a substantially improved proposal, but that doesn't mean that Trump or Putin will necessarily be grateful. This is a chance for them to throw up their hands and declare that peace is impossible, just as much as it is a chance for them to move toward an end to this conflict. It's worth pointing out that this entire draft proposal was Russia's idea. The initial deal essentially comprised Russia's terms, it was immensely favorable to Russian interests, and if outside analysis is to be believed, portions of the text were adopted verbatim from the original Russian. Vladimir Putin and his inner circle may be immensely corrupt, brutally authoritarian, and invested in an entirely unjustifiable war of expansion. But they're not stupid. Russia has proved completely unwilling to budge on its terms to end the war, but it's under no illusions that after nearly 4 years of all-out fighting, Ukraine will simply wake up one day and see Russia's point of view. If Washington were to somehow pressure Ukraine so strongly that it accepted the original peace proposal as written, then Putin would, of course, be very happy. But that's probably not Moscow's plan. Russia simply must have anticipated that Ukraine and Europe would react poorly, and that it was at least somewhat likely that Washington would agree to try and amend the deal in subsequent negotiations. That's not a surprise. And so the real question is, what was the Kremlin hoping to achieve after these talks began? Obviously, we can't know for sure, but like Europe and the larger community of international observers, we suspect that the true goal may be to sever the US-Ukraine connection for good. Already, reports have started to circulate on what Russia's true objectives might be. According to analysis by the Institute for the Study of War, published on the 21st of November, Russian insiders have signaled to global sources that the Kremlin doesn't even support its own version of the peace proposal because even that draft was too lenient toward Ukraine. Per the ISW, one well-placed Russian source alleged that, according to the Kremlin, the initial proposal was too generous with its security guarantees for Kyiv, too generous with the personnel cap placed on Ukraine's military, and shouldn't have included the possibility that Russian frozen assets could be used for anything except, well, handing back to Russia. According to another source, Putin is in no rush to agree to a peace deal with Ukraine, and it's Trump that's trying to push all this along. Publicly, Putin continues to emphasize that Russia will achieve all of its war goals through military means, while the Kremlin continues to insist that its victory in Ukraine is inevitable. Prominent leaders in the Russian State Duma have derided the deal in front of the Russian public, insisting that it cannot lead to a real peace and that anything short of Russia's, quote, unequivocal victory on the front would not be enough. Their public statements are hardly an accident, and the Kremlin would not allow those messages to circulate to the Russian public unless they represented a stance that Russia was willing to back up in front of its own people. If Russia really did intend for this peace proposal, seemingly written by its own representative, to lead to a ceasefire, then its public and private posture toward the agreement would make no sense. That's not what's happening here. Russia sees the combination of factors in front of it, from Washington's rush to get a deal done, to Ukraine's flagging domestic situation, to Europe's limited ability to pick up the slack if Washington stepped out. And at least right now, it appears that the US-Russia peace proposal is meant to exploit that situation. The deal provides Washington, and it provides Trump with an outlet for all this frustration with Kyiv, and gives Trump an opportunity to believe that he's tried everything, his envoys have done the best they can, and those damn Ukrainians simply won't step up and take the truce. The deal forces Ukraine and its European allies to repudiate the proposal in its initial form as forcefully and as quickly as possible, and Russia understands the way Trump and his allies tend to react when a deal they propose is forcefully repudiated. Russia knows that between Ukraine's desertion crisis and its corruption scandal, it's harder for Washington to justify believing in Kyiv than it's ever been. The link between Washington and Kyiv was already fragile, and for Moscow, this is a chance to sever that link permanently, or at least until there's a transition of power in the US. And once that connection has been cut, Russia really does have a chance to find its way toward a battlefield victory. Europe can continue to supply military assistance and even buy weapons off of the United States to then send toward the front lines, but by itself, that won't be enough. Russia is facing mounting challenges, and those challenges will bite within the next year or two, but they haven't really set in yet, and Russia has enough available reinforcements that it may believe it can achieve short-term military successes. Remember, the war in Ukraine today is what it's always been, a brutal, desperate war of attrition where both sides have done everything in their power to push each other to the brink. Ukraine has held out this long, and it could hold out for a while longer with the full support of the NATO alliance. But if the United States disengages entirely, Ukraine's ability to continue fighting in the way that it's been fighting will be in serious jeopardy. Europe isn't ready to make up the gap, at least not yet, and Russia knows it. For now, Ukraine is still defiant, speaking to his nation ahead of talks on Saturday and at the same time commemorating the 1930s Great Famine that killed millions of Ukrainians under Joseph Stalin. Zelensky told his nation, quote, "We are once again defending ourselves against Russia, which has not changed and is once again bringing death. We defended, defend, and will always defend Ukraine. Because only here is our home, and in our home, Russia will definitely not be the master." But what Zelensky didn't say matters just as much. Ukraine could be just days away from being abandoned permanently by its most important global ally in a manipulated diplomatic breakdown that Russia seems to have engineered in ways that America's leadership either doesn't understand or, worse, wants to happen. What happens in the coming days will be critical, not just for Ukraine to survive this Russian invasion, but to prevent the next one. If Ukraine is abandoned for good, then preventing that next invasion or even surviving it may be impossible. Thank you for watching.